Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those connected today in this webinar to commemorate World Refugee Day. Our topic for today is the right to higher education for refugee and forcibly displaced students, dialogue for strategies for empowerment. On behalf of the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, UNESCO IESALC, the Durban University of Technology, and Kiron, we thank you for joining this webinar. Before starting today's program, we invite the panelists to keep their microphones off when not participating. We take the opportunity to announce that this event has simultaneous translation between English and Spanish and Arabic. We also remind you that this event is being recorded and will be released on the UNESCO IESALC YouTube channel. Participants are welcome to post their questions in the chat box in English, Spanish, or Arabic at any time. We will take up as many questions as we can in the last part of the webinar. World Refugee Day is an international day designated by the United Nations to honor refugees around the globe. World Refugee Day is an occasion to build empathy and understanding for their plight and to recognize their resilience and rebuilding their lives. Today, we have planned a two-part dialogue. First, we will take a multi-level perspective to show the work of higher education institutions, non-governmental organizations, and international organizations in promoting the right, and UNESCO in promoting the right to higher education for refugee and forcibly displaced people. Then the focus will turn to a student dialogue that will showcase the diverse life experiences of current students who themselves have gone through forcibly displacement experiences. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Alain for welcome remarks. Over to Dr. Alain is the Director of International Education and Partnerships, IEP, at the Durban University of Technology. Is also the President of the International Education Association of South Africa. He's the Chair of the Southern Africa Nordic Center, a consortium of 60 universities across 15 countries from the Southern African and Nordic regions. Dr. Samos is also a member of the board of the International Visual Exchange for some Consortium and represents South Africa on the network of International Education Associations, the peak global body for International Education Association. Currently, he also serves as a board member of the International Center for Nonviolence and the M.L. Sultan Charitable and Educational Trust. Over to you, Dr. Samos. I think you're muted, Dr. Samos.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Program Director. I'm delighted to be here today with all of you to be able to share some words of welcome on this really important event. I think we all know that World Refugee Day is an international day designated by the United Nations to honor refugees around the globe. And it is something that we are committed to engaging in over the years. Each year, on the 20th of June, this day aims to honor people who have been forced to flee, and we highlight ways in which we can champion their rights to seek safety, to build support for economic and social inclusion, and to advocate for solutions to their plight. Today's webinar will have a special focus. It will focus on the right to higher education for refugees, asylum seekers, and forcibly displaced individuals to become students and to take their academic and intellectual aspirations forward. I am delighted that 4 organizations have come together in order to organize this. The Durban University of Technology working with UNESCO, the International Institute for Higher Education, Latin America and the Caribbean, Kiron, the Open Higher Education organization, which is an edtech nonprofit providing refugees and underserved communities with access to free, high-quality education, and for reskilling these individuals to allow them access to the digital environment and to strategic partners. I think this event has the potential not just to highlight the plight of individuals, champion their cause, but I think there is potential for us to come together to work collectively so that this day is celebrated on the 20th of June, but the work around this continues throughout the year. And I want to wish all of you well on the deliberations today, and I'm absolutely certain it will be enriching and fulfilling. Thank you very much, Program Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samuels, for your welcome to today's session. In bringing you today's webinar, we have 3 distinguished institutions and organizations who have partnered. The first of which is the Durban University of Technology. To introduce you, we have Professor Alain Tschudin, Professor of Peace Studies and Director of the International Center of Nonviolence at DUS. Alain Tschudin has also previously served as the lead consultant to the United Nations on fast-tracking the SDGs in Africa. Professor Tschudin has also worked with UNICEF and Save the Children on child protection in Africa and the Middle East. With a PhD in psychology from Natal University and a PhD in moral philosophy and theology from the University of Cambridge, Professor Tschudin was recently elected as the president of the Association Montessori International. Professor Tschudin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah. Muchas gracias. Thank you to my colleague from DUT, to Dr. Laverne Samuels, for the kind introduction to the event. I would like to share my screen with you just to give us some idea of framing what we're going to be addressing today. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Okay, it should be coming up very soon. I hope that you can all see it. Okay, so I wanted to start with the definition of the words, because I think very often we actually forget what's involved when we're talking about things. And the word refugee has a very, very specific context, actually. It denoted a certain type of person in the 17th century, namely a Protestant Christian who fled France to seek refuge elsewhere from persecution, religious persecution, after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed religious liberty and civil rights. And it hails from the French word réfugié, which is going in search of refuge. Okay, so the word that we use today definitely links in with this idea of fleeing persecution to a place, and we'll see with respect to the word refuge, a place that is going to provide some safe haven, a place that will provide protection or shelter. And so if we look at this word refuge, it is the state of being safe, of being protected or sheltered from pursuit, danger, or difficulty, a place that, or an institution that provides safe accommodation for those who have suffered violence, abuse, or neglect. And working in a higher educational institution, you know, it's a challenge, because as you'll see in principle, what we really would like to do is provide a refuge for our students who've come to us with challenges, literally having to escape from, flee away, or avoid some of the incredibly negative human experiences that are far from a talk shop. So I wanted to just give you, before we look at the word itself and some description, historically, if we track the word, at least in English, you'll see that in the aftermath of the First World War, the use of the word refugee skyrocketed and tapered off towards the end of the Second World War. And then you'll see it flattens out somewhat, and then in the 1970s escalates again, and it hasn't really gone back too much other than the early 2000s. But if you look here, you see an uptick in the use of the word refugee from around, the 2010s. We're all aware of the wars, internal, external crises, escalating natural disasters that we see. And so I've said here, what's in a word? Well, clearly a lot. Now, it's quite easy, if you will, to think about this in a cold, hard, cognitive way. For a second, I'd like us to get away from that into the actual lived experience of being a refugee. So this is an excerpt from an account that was shared with me during my own work with refugees in Durban, South Africa. And here's a description actually of what fleeing and running away means. The forest is not an equatorial forest like you might imagine it to be. It houses villages with no electricity and lots of trees, far from the city. When the Rwandan troops and Kabila's rebel soldiers started attacking Bukavu, we fled westward to the forests in our thousands. We fled westward. The Hutus were already entrenched then. We had to pay them homage, to cross bridges over water, food, money, clothes. Some of us only had bread. When the bombing started, the Hutus would run with us deeper and deeper into the forest. It was madness. Terrible things happened there. Rape, killing, anything and everything taken by force. Powerlessness. Babies were smashed to a pulp in front of their parents. Mothers raped in their homes in front of their families. I managed to return home to our family after about 100 kilometers, but others continued for hundreds of kilometers. And indeed, I would argue thousands of kilometers across entire continents, and not only within continents, but physically across continents. So the hard-hitting reality of actually being a refugee is something that I would really like to sit with us in particular on this day. Here's a little quote, since we are in South Africa. This comes from the UNHCR about the rights and responsibilities of refugees. So as you'll see, if we start off with rights, the right to formal written recognition of refugee status, and then the second point there, the right to full legal protection, which includes the rights set out in Chapter 2 of the South African Constitution, and the right to remain. So Chapter 2 is our Bill of Rights. I will pick up on that shortly. And then you can apply for permanent residence after 5 years of residence. You're entitled to an identity document and a refugee travel document. You're entitled to seek employment. You are entitled to the same basic health services and primary education which the inhabitants of the Republic receive from time to time. I'm framing this because I'd like to return to this in terms of our challenges subsequently. And then the responsibilities to abide by the country's laws, to apply for a refugee ID, the relevant requisite documentation, to remain as well as to travel, and then to notify the officials of any change in address. Okay. Here is the South African Constitution. You heard me say that Chapter 2 looks at our Bill of Rights. So here are the rights of one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. And you will see there the right to education under number 29. I wanted to zoom in on that right, actually, because it speaks directly to our topic today. And I don't know, there may be other challenges, other countries out there who experience similar challenges to ourselves. But let's look at education. So everyone has the right to a basic education, including adult basic education, and to further education, which the state, through reasonable measures, must make progressively available and accessible. Okay, there are other issues around education there in the official language, and there must be equity, practicability, historical redress, okay, and then the non-discriminatory clauses. Okay, however, you saw earlier that refugees are entitled to the rights that South Africans have. Okay, very often this is not known, and when people approach us, they are quite bewildered to learn that they in fact can obtain an education here. And this is something that I think is really important for us as educators. It's the awareness, okay, and then the access. So can I get education? Yes, you can. You're entitled to the same education as South African nationals. And then there's some explanation of that there. And can I get technical and vocational education and training, which by nature gears you towards very practical employment in the South African labor market. And then care of our colleagues at UNHCR, these very helpful pages. But again, we all know that you could have the awareness, the information. You might even realize, well, okay, I've got access, but then what do we do about the reality which often requires funding? And hence this slide, which speaks to funding. Are there bursaries and scholarships available for refugees? Yes, there are. In our context, the DAFI ones, the Albert Einstein German Academic Refugee Initiative scholarships is listed there. And then helpfully, UNHCR lists under their services a number of opportunities. You will see the website listed at the bottom of the screen. So I think it's really important for us to be aware of these aspects in the struggle for refugees or people who've been displaced to further their professional development and their personal development. What I did want to do now, having given you some sort of framework about what we face in South Africa, what our legislation is, and the possibilities that exist, I'd just like to give you some fast facts about our own sub-region. As of March 2023, Southern Africa has 9.3 million forcibly displaced people and refugee returnees. The region has the largest IDP population in sub-Saharan Africa, with refugee camps and settlements in multiple countries, in some instances hosting decades-long displaced refugee populations. There are multiple causes involved here. One is conflict, crisis, and we see on an escalating basis the effects of climate change and natural disasters. We cannot neglect to mention emergency situations. 2/3 of forcibly displaced people in this region have fled conflict in the Eastern DRC. You heard that quote earlier, came from that context, with 6.2 million IDPs and 1.3 million asylum seekers. Northern Mozambique has 1.3 million internally displaced people due to extremist violence and natural disasters. So I just wanted to set the scene for you with respect to the fact that we probably have around 10 million people officially documented in the region who are displaced by these various causes. I then wanted to look at outflows and inflows, and you'll see here that the countries of origin, so this comes from our colleagues at DESA and the migration portal. So if you look at the top 5 countries of origin of immigrants residing in Southern Africa, you will see the first number is from Zimbabwe, constituting the greatest single contributor there, followed by Mozambique, and then a three-way tie between Angola, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it goes without saying, we know the CAR has had major conflict, as has the DRC, some of the legacies inherited from previous conflicts, and challenges, associated challenges happening there. If one then looks at the top 5 destination countries of immigrants from Southern Africa, you will see there that South Africa is the receiving country. 23%, so close to 1 in 4 of the people who are moving around will come to South Africa, followed by the UK, and then Uganda, and then a tie between the United States of America and France. So bearing in mind what we've seen with respect to South Africa, I wanted to focus in on this because I think that we have a fairly extreme situation here for the sub-region. There are other areas that obviously do have very high refugee numbers, but a 2023 World Bank estimate places refugees in South Africa at 75,512, a decline from 121,000 in 2015. The South African population is estimated at 61 million people this year, with close on 4 million people being foreign-born who live here. That's 6.4% roughly. In 2020, South Africa was the top destination for immigrants in Southern Africa, with a total migrant population of just over 2 million, 28% of the total, which represents less than 3% of the total population. So, and you'll see why I'm going through these numbers very soon. The refugee population in South Africa increased from 6,800 people in 1997 to 66,000 in 2013. So if you have a look at that, that's just over 1.5 decades. And then substantially to 112,000 and 121,000 in 2014 and 2015, respectively. It dropped quite drastically in 2016 and stabilized at around 89,000, just shy of 90,000, between 2017 and 2019. There's a similar trend with respect to asylum seekers, just under 500,000 in 2014, and then a substantial rise to 1,100,000 in 2015, followed by a monumental decline the year after to 218,000. You may remember that South Africa had a series of xenophobic attacks in 2015 and a further drop to 188,000 in 2019. Refugees in South Africa come primarily from Somalia, the DRC, the Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Burundi, and Zimbabwe.
And Professor Tschudin,
yes,
we're gonna need. Could you please wrap up with, because
I will wrap
you're
up.
Over time. Thanks
okay,
so much.
I'm very sorry. Let me wrap up then for you. So our asylum seekers are typically young. This is relevant. 71% are 19 to 35, with another 17% aged 18 and under. Okay. I'm going to skip what's happened in terms of the processing here. I'll share the presentation. But just to say that not everything that glitters is gold. A lot of people come here because of the shining lights and some of the mythology around it. However, increasing amendments to refugee legislation have made it very difficult for people seeking to be in this country. I won't dwell on that now. You're welcome to look at it later. What I wanted to say is that words on paper and the legislation that we have does not necessarily equate with daily life on the ground. Our constitution may be really progressive, but the leadership, civil service, and citizenship have nationalistic tendencies. Refugees and migrants face profound discrimination, prejudice, scapegoating, and xenophobic violence. They're often denied access to healthcare, education, other social services, and employment, and face being illegally deported and separated from their families who remain in country. Here's the nitty-gritty of it. This is a challenge for us as educators. Only 65 registered refugees are students at DUT. We have 33,000 students. These are mainly undergraduates, and historically, less than 10% of our graduates at the International Center of Nonviolence have come from the refugee community. So this is really something that I hope we'll be able to engage today. And then finally, just a plea for advocacy and for action and solidarity. And that's the recognition of the universal human dignity of all, not just on World Refugee Day, but every day, everywhere, and for everyone to reach their potential. I really hope today will help advance that, and thank you for bearing with me. I apologize for going over time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Professor Tschudin, for such an interesting presentation. Now understanding the importance that the third sector plays in the contribution of refugees and forcibly displaced people to access to higher education. Today we have with us Farah Mansour. Farah is a project manager at Kiron, experienced strategist with a demonstrated history of working in social media and digital marketing. Farah Mansour brings over 7 years of experience working for both national and international non-for-profit organizations. advocating for youth, education, and women empowerment, implementing advocacy campaigns concerned with SDG goals. Her greatest strength is the multi-educational backgrounds and fields of experience, which enable her to create and implement comprehensive projects. Farah, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction, and hi, everyone. I'm really humbled to be part of this webinar. I'll be sharing my screen as well. I'll make it short. And maybe the whole idea, the whole goal of my presentation today is to call for action and to showcase how you can benefit actually from Kiron and benefit the beneficiaries that you're collaborating with. So let me just share my screen. Okay, I don't think it's working. Maybe I don't have the access, but that's all right. At Kiron Open Higher Education, we're a non-profit that is based in Germany, Berlin. We started in 2015, and now we have a physical office in Jordan. But having physical offices in Jordan and Berlin does not mean that this is the only locations that we actually are implementing the projects at. We've recently promoted for a project in Venezuela. We're working with Africa. We worked in the Middle East, the North African countries. So because we are a digital platform, we have the flexibility to provide education for all. And this is actually what we stand for. What I want to showcase is the countries that we're running in, and also the countries of origin of our students. So we have students from around the world. Mainly, the highest numbers are from Syria, Turkey, Ukraine, of course, Sudan, and Jordan. Recently, we've also expanded to Afghanistan, so we have Afghani beneficiaries as well. At Kiron, we have an online campus. It's free for everyone. You can have a lifetime access. So this is my invitation to you to log into Kiron campus. It's kiron.com. Register with just a proof of an ID. Of course, we have the safeguarding guidelines to make sure that everyone's data is protected. So this is my invitation to you today to take part of this cohesive platform. We have over 500 courses from the top 500 universities around the world. This is what we provide. We provide even certification to the students upon completing the courses that we're working on. Of course, at Kiron, we align with the Sustainable Development Goals. We believe in inclusive education. We also believe in lifelong learning and gender equality. Of course, every course that is provided through Kiron campus is also connected with the economic growth. So we don't just leave the beneficiaries hanging on there after completing the course. We also provide some kind of support and advisory to them to facilitate their pathways. About Kiron campus, it's a self-built learning platform. So I want to encourage you to write to us in case you have any kind of extra features that you want to see. It's the campus is very user-friendly. It's in continuous development. So whenever you need an extra course, whenever you need to create or even curate a certain course, we can provide that. We offer our campus in 7 different languages for now. We've recently also added the feature of podcast. So you don't even need to just explore the campus through the written content. You can also download some of the courses through a podcast in ahead of time to save data. This is how we think of refugees who are based in camps. So our target audience, I would like to highlight that it's noteworthy mentioning that we promote for refugees, displaced and vulnerable communities across the world. So we think of people who are not studying at the comfort of their homes. Of course, we have people who are inside camps, living in caravans, for instance, in Jordan, in Azraq camp, in Zatari camp, and we're developing our campus to meet their needs and to serve them as well. For the beneficiaries, as I mentioned, it's not just about learning a certain course or getting the certification at the end of the course. What we're trying to do is also provide some kind of advisory for their pathways. So we have 3 different pathways that we can support the students with through our student support officers. We have the employment pathway, the university or the academic-based pathway, and also the entrepreneurship pathway. All of these pathways are available through Kiron, and we can help you with the matching, the placement, and even connecting with potential partners who can support you on your journey. Just to give you a few numbers, 83% of our students have reported that they improved their sector-specific skills. 71% said that they learned what they learned helped them in their professional life, and 73% say that Kiron helped them to figure out what career to pursue. We have a 75% completion rate. And this is something that we're very proud of. So 75% of our students who start a course and enroll in a certain course would actually complete it towards the end. Finally, I wanted to share some remarks from our students across the world. Some of them have become facilitators with us, so we don't leave again the beneficiaries hanging on there. And this is my call to action to all partners, to all stakeholders, to follow up with the students and to provide them what they need after completing the certain program, the certain courses. But I'm going to stop actually here because I'm really proud of one of our brightest beneficiaries, Anoud. We will be hearing from her soon in this webinar. So I'll leave it actually to her to hear from her her personal story and her motivation. That's all for now. Of course, if you needed any further questions, I know that we have audience from universities. So any further questions, of course, I can be reached out, and I'll be happy to support with info sessions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah, and also previously thanks to Dr. Tschudin and Dr. Mansour for providing the perspective. Let me now turn to our third level in the multi-level perspective, which is that of the international organizations and in particular UNESCO. I would like to give the floor to Sabzalieva, who is Head of Research and Foresight at UNESCO IESALC. Dr. Sabzalieva is an international higher education specialist with 2 decades of research, teaching, policy analysis, consultancy, and university administration expertise spanning 3 continents. At UNESCO IESALC, she leads flagship projects on the right to higher education, digital transformations of higher education, and the futures of higher education. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks so much, and thanks to our previous speakers as well for introducing the first part of this webinar, where I think it's really interesting to see these different kind of multi-leveled perspectives on protecting the right to higher education. So that's also what I'm going to talk about briefly. Let me just bring up a few slides here. I won't take up too much time. So we are focusing specifically today on refugees and forcibly displaced people, but I also want to make the case here for protecting and promoting the right to higher education for all. I'm going to start with just a few words about our institute. For those of you who might be new to us, probably know about UNESCO's work. We are the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. So 25 years of working to promote the universal right to higher education. And you can see here on the slide, we do this in 4 different ways. So we, as mentioned, promote the universal right to higher education. We empower institutions and higher education systems to be more responsive, inclusive, relevant and efficient. We work to nurture innovation in higher education and to re-envision internationalization. And here you see the mark of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I will say a little bit more about in just a second, but which inform, of course, all of our work, being the UN flagship initiative. So let's ask, what is the right to education and what's the right to higher education? So we would see these 2 things as connected together. So first and foremost, a fundamental right for people. We saw before from the South African Constitution and Bill of Rights how that is protected. We also have in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, Article 26, which reminds us that everyone has the right to education. And further in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from 1966, Article 13 reminds us that higher education shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. There's a lot to unpack in that statement, but I think one of the things that is important to see in that is that when we're thinking about the right to education, we often stop in thinking about school education or compulsory education. But actually, I think it's the perspective that is perhaps more useful to think about is education as a lifelong, as a life-wide spectrum. So that includes all forms of education at different levels, and therefore including higher education. And as I mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the current kind of normative framework shaping the work of UNESCO, of other UN organizations, but also many other stakeholders around the world as we work together towards these 17 goals. And in particular, SDG 4 on quality education is relevant for the topic at hand here. So we know through that access to good quality higher education is a necessary condition, not only to help fulfill the targets for SDG 4, but all of the SDGs as a whole. So that gives a bit of background when we think about this idea of this right to education. We also would stress the importance of taking a student-centered perspective when we think about the right to higher education. What we don't have in the middle of this Venn diagram is some graphic image of the student themselves, but imagine them there. And we think about this student-centered perspective in higher education, again, in a sort of connected and life cycle kind of way. So we often talk about access to higher education. So who gets to go to higher education? What are their pipelines? What are their pathways to get into higher education? How can we widen participation? But the right to higher education doesn't stop there. It also is relevant to think about what happens when students are in higher education, often having overcome multiple hurdles in order to get there. So here we can think about what might be called student success or persistence. So this is the idea about how do we support every student who's in higher education to achieve their best potential? What are the structures that we have in place? What are the things that we're doing to support those students? And we can also then think about this life cycle as continuing beyond higher education. So within higher education institutions, students are educated and supported, but what happens after that? How are we supporting them to be citizens? How are we supporting them to enter into the labour market? And so on. So as you can see, it's quite a big topic, but it's a holistic one. And I think it's really important to remember that when we're thinking about the right to higher education. At UNESCO IESALC, at our institute, we developed last year a new social justice and rights-based framework for understanding the right to higher education. I have the reference here on the left of the screen. I don't unfortunately have the time to kind of break this down into all its component parts, but I will briefly say this is a multi-layered framework. So starting from the outside, we think about the 5 A's. You may have heard of the 4 A's framework that's now been expanded. So we have availability, accessibility, acceptability, adaptability, and accountability. All of those are features of how higher education systems, structures should be. Then at the kind of institutional level, we've got this concept of inclusive excellence. And then, as I mentioned, students being at the heart. So here we are representing specifically equity deserving groups in these blue circles. We've given 5 here just as representation, but of course there may be more. And equity deserving groups is a term that we are using to talk about, for example, racialized people, indigenous people and minorities, people with limited economic means, persons with disabilities, women, LGBTIQ+ people, forcibly displaced people, people from remote and rural locations. And the final aspect of this framework you see represented in the graphic with the dotted lines, the connections between equity deserving groups, is intersectionality. And this is the idea that we can't sort of think about potentially only one equity deserving group in isolation, that often those are interconnected, and those intersections play out differently in terms of how we in higher education, at whichever level we're working at, need to support those students, taking them for their own individual unique richness and benefits. So that's a very brief introduction to the framework that we've developed. We'd be happy during the Q&A to talk more about that, or encourage you to take a look at our report, and we'll post a link to the report in English and Spanish in the chat for this Q&A as well. So now when we focus in on the equity deserving group that we're looking at today, as it is World Refugee Day, so what do we know so far about refugees, forcibly displaced people, and the right to higher education? So we've been doing a large project in this work on the right to higher education, partially supported by the Open Societies Foundation. And as part of that, we ran a series of consultations looking at different aspects of the right to higher education. So for example, in different regional perspectives, but also through different thematic perspectives. And I'd like to share just in my final slide here, a few points from the consultation on refugees and forcibly displaced people. So we know that in the world, 100 million people were forcibly displaced in 2022. That's a UN figure. We also know, if you think about that 100 million figure, and you think about those people who might be at a point of applying or going to higher education, only 6% of refugees are enrolled in higher education. There is a large UN campaign called 1530 to try to increase that number to 15% by 2030. But in comparison, 6% of refugees, so globally, if you look at the enrollment ratio, the proportion of people who are in higher education is 40%. Of course, that varies region by region, but the point I'm making is that there's a very large differential between 6% and 40%. So there is a lot of work that we need to do to better support refugees and forcibly displaced people so that they can enjoy their right to higher education. Some of the challenges that emerged in our consultation relate to systems of higher education. So we often see that those systems hosting refugees and FDP, forcibly displaced people, are already overburdened, and especially in the low and middle income countries where refugees and FDP tend to congregate as a result of the geography. In many cases, we see that when refugees and FDPs try to access higher education, they're treated as international students, and that often means that they are going to be charged very high tuition fees, and therefore we've got high financial barriers for a group who are already facing a lot of economic issues. And there are legal administrative obstacles, as our first speaker today spoke a little bit to as well. So what can governments do to better support refugees and forcibly displaced people? First, we could look at facilitation of recognition as refugee status. We know a lot of people get stuck in a kind of limbo where that recognition isn't happening, and without the recognition, they aren't able to access the benefits or the education of the host country. We can look at supporting ways to provide alternatives to documentation that may be unavailable, and governments can look to introduce mechanisms to recognize prior qualifications and learning. And one example here would be UNESCO's qualifications passport, which again, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about later on. And what about higher education institutions? We think that they could offset costs and review tuition fee rates, particularly in those cases where refugees and FDP are charged international student fees. They may provide counselling services and mental health support, specifically thinking about what are the specific needs of this group compared to other groups of students. And they may need to offer additional academic and language services. So those are some ideas, I think, to help us identify some of the challenges to the right to higher education, but also some of the ways forward that we could move in that direction. So thank you very much for your time. And now I think we get to move over to the second and more interesting part. We're actually going to hear from some students themselves. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks so much, Egna, for contributing with this presentation that brings UNESCO's perspective and contribution to the inclusive access to higher education by refugees, asylum seekers, and forcibly displaced people. In the next section, we will take up the dialogue in a different way. We are joined by 3 students and graduates who have agreed to share their stories of accessing higher education. They will discuss the challenges they have experienced and the empowerment that came with through overcoming these challenges. We also invite you to leave your questions in the Q&A box for the next session or in the chat section too. For this part of the webinar, we are joined by Divinia G2, a specialist in international education adults. Divinia G2 is a specialist at the Durban University at the International Education and Partnerships Office at the Durban University of Technology. She has over 15 years experience in higher education internationalization and has a keen interest in higher education transformation. She has gained extensive expertise in international virtual engagement, specifically in COIL as an approach to inclusivity in internationalization. Ms. G2 is also a PhD candidate at the University of Western Cape, with her research focusing on global structural dynamics of academic collaborative research. So the floor is yours. No, I think, Divinia, I don't know if you're gonna introduce Candice McCain.
Yes, I'll introduce her. So thank you.
Okay, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So colleagues, in our discussion today, we count on the participation of 2 students who are in higher education and 1 student who has already completed higher education. They will kindly share their experiences and strategies in higher education. However, before we move on to the student dialogue, we thought that it is important to ensure that the student speakers that we have with us today have the necessary support from our institutions in recounting their experiences. So we have called on experts to provide the support. And before we start the student dialogue, I'd like to invite Candice McCain, who is a psychologist in the Counseling and Health Services at DUT, to speak to us about the importance of support needed from the institutions and organizations for refugees, asylum seekers, and forcibly displaced students. And these the support will be offered to the 3 students who you will hear from today. So I'd like to hand over to Candice before we start with the student dialogue. Thank you. Candice?
Thank you so much. Let me just make sure I am organized.
Yes, we can see you.
Awesome. All right. So I am going to just speak very briefly. I know we don't have a lot of time, but my most important point that I think I would like to focus on today is mental health, and to be honest, how little of it there is out there. So we often look at illness in terms of mobility and morbidity when we think from a medical perspective. But of course, there are other aspects to wellness, and I'd like to touch on that. So mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Now, that is essentially a person who is well, who is doing okay. Now, it is very important to note that mental health is not the absence of a disorder. Mental health is functioning at your optimal level. A disorder would be somebody functioning at a very suboptimal level, possibly even at a dysfunctional level, depending on the severity. So just to give you an idea of how we look at people, we obviously look at people from the physical perspective, the biological perspective, if you will, but we also have to take into account people's social contexts, their mental wellness, their emotional wellness, as well as their spiritual wellness. So people are complex, and we need to bear that in mind when offering support to any individual, but in particular, students who are coming from countries where they have experienced displacement. If they are refugees, we need to look at this in a different light. Now, just in terms of the basic prevalence of disorders that we encounter, and these are just very everyday things, probably things that I've seen in the last month. We are looking at, in an average population, I suppose whatever an average population would look like, but just generally, anxiety disorders, that is 9% of the population. Major depressive disorders, 7%. Post-traumatic stress disorder, that would be about 9%. Alcohol use disorder, 16.2. Just note there that for that particular one, I'm looking at the student age group. So essentially from say 19 to 20, I think 26. So just to contextualize that. And then schizophrenia would be about 1% of the population. So these are not unusual, and they are very common in the higher education setting. As I say, I think I've seen all of these in the past month, just to normalize, the reality of mental difficulties that people face. But the big question, I think, is what does this mean for a refugee or for a displaced student coming into the higher education institutions? Now, we would anticipate that possibly there would be much higher levels of trauma, depending on the environment that you've come from. We would anticipate higher levels of depression and anxiety, because given people's experiences, that makes a lot of sense. So what we do is we offer support for all students, and we work as closely as we can with the international office and with the international student organizations. And in general, we offer support to students in the form of career counseling. So for people coming in, you may not know what you want to study, you may not know what you are able to study. Our office will offer you career counseling. And in terms of even once you are in the institution, preparing for your career to move on, that is something that is very important, especially if you want to eventually engage meaningfully in the community and be productive. We offer academic support because we know full well that people come from different places when it comes to the foundations of academics. So we are there to offer support in terms of different study methods. We understand that students learn differently. We try and figure out what students need in terms to learn effectively, and we assist from that perspective. And then we also offer personal counseling. So that can be for pretty much anything, from conflict with family to relationship difficulties to disorders. One of the things that we run in our department is an anxiety support group. And that's been quite well attended. It's something that has been very beneficial to students. So one of the things that I would like to leave with you is that if you require any assistance, this is what the student counseling centers are here for. We are here for all students. And we would like to encourage you to please make use of our services. And yeah, just generally to keep your mental wellness in mind. And if you feel that you need assistance, please make contact with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Candice, for that presentation. Now we're going to move on to the student dialogue and have our students join us. For this purpose, we are accompanied by Anud Alnachawati, who is an anatomy and cell biology student currently studying at McGill University in Canada. After a 2-year interruption in accessing higher education and applying to many scholarships, she persevered and successfully gained acceptance into McGill. This was aided by the 100 Women, 1,000 Lives Scholarship and the McGill Award. Originally from Syria, Anud aspires to pursue a career in the medical field and contribute to its advancement. Her ultimate goal is to inspire individuals, particularly women, to pursue higher education regardless of any barriers they may face. So, Anud, could you share with us the different strategies you use to access higher education?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Divinia, for your introduction. I just want to make sure that you can hear my voice well. Is everything okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Anud. Thank you. Please go ahead.
That's perfect. Thank you. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on the time zone you are in. So this is Anud, and my story begins after I completed high school in Jordan, where I achieved an impressive score of 97% out of 100. And this score allowed me to dream of attending medical school, which is something I'm so passionate about. I never imagined that my nationality or my financial situation would hinder my access to higher education. I thought that my skills and my academic qualifications were the most important factors. But unfortunately, being a refugee has never been easy and presented countless challenges. I had to put my education on hold for 2 years after high school. And during this time, I faced many obstacles, starting from being a first generation in my family with uneducated parents. I had no guidance or support, limited opportunities to access higher education in Jordan, and English language barriers, weaknesses in my technology skills as well. So all of these were something that really hinder me to access higher education, but I refused to lose hope, and I believed that I had a purpose in this world and that being a refugee should not extinguish my dreams. I made a firm decision to fight for my aspirations and to leave the negative comments that came my way. I took advantage of having internet. I embarked on a self-direction journey to learn English online, sought opportunities to develop my academic skills through platforms like Paper Airplanes or Kiron. I also use YouTube to learn how to write effective motivation letters for scholarships. And I can remember applying to over 15 scholarships in different countries. And while I faced rejection from almost all of them, there was one scholarship that stood out. And this was a 100 Women, 10,000 Lives Scholarship organized by a Mansour organization. And I considered this scholarship actually as a dream opportunity because only 2 women were selected among hundreds of applicants. And in 2021, I was fortunate enough to be one of those 2 women to receive this scholarship. As Divinia mentioned, currently I'm studying anatomy and physiology at McGill University, which is ranked the 2nd best university in Canada. And my long term is to become a physician. So today, as some of you join us, I want to emphasize the reason why I decided to share my story. And if there's one takeaway from my journey, especially for the students who are listening to me right now, never lose hope and never be afraid to fight for your dreams. And remember that education is a fundamental right for every human being, regardless of their background. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this webinar like put in action and try really to help their student refugees. And thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Anoud, for sharing your story with us. It's really inspiring, and I'm sure is going to inspire a lot of other young women and young people to pursue their dreams and persevere as you did. I would like to now invite Mr. Javier Rosa to share his story with us. Javier is a musician, singer, arranger, and music teacher. Graduated from the Federal University of Bahia in instrumental performance, the French horn. Before moving to Brazil, Javier completed his TVET studies in Experimental University of the Arts. Javier has performed in several important ensembles in his country, including the Orquestra Sinfónica Teresa Carreno de Venezuela, the Simon Bolivar Big Band Jazz, and the Orquestra Sinfónica Nacional Juvenil de Venezuela. Javier, could you share and tell us about your higher education journey and how you persevered? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Javier Rosa. Thank you for the invitation. Sorry, my English is not very good looking. And then I want to speak in Spanish. Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm quite pleased. I left my country given the situation that we have experienced and the search of a new opportunity to improve, to be better. So in the search for a job, I noticed that there was a limiting factor in the educational part. And thanks to my friends and thanks to the closeness that some of them had with the Federal University of Bahia, I gotten closer to the university to know the professors, to know the orchestra that was working there within the university, that was part of professors and part students. Then with the information that they provided to me and sharing with them in the rehearsals, I had access of being a special guest student invited. That means that they already had a program to invite people from other countries for 2 terms to the Federal University. I would like to say that the Federal University of Bahia is a public institution where there is not tuition fees, is free, and that caught my attention a lot. Also the benefits that allowed me the fact of being associated to an educational institution, because in Brazil, despite the fact that I had the necessary documents, I couldn't have a stable job. As a musician for 4 years, I only work on informal venues. So an institution that was getting me close to the territory that was helping me was the university part. So from that moment onwards, we had the first editorial they promoted for people in precarious situations. That detail, that program that appeared online and that came to me through my friends, my clarinet friend Patricia Perez and David Zanzilba, who is Brazilian. They were students and officers of the university as musicians that provided me this link and this information. The editor was about supporting people, refugees and migrants, trans and quilomboado. Quilomboado for the Brazilian are those people that can show the origin of black race, where they haven't been enslaved, they got together and they work in specific populations. So as it's considered that these people with access to public education and low resources are also having these favorable conditions to keep their education, the higher education. We were all into detail with these special numbers. These numbers were, for example, in my case, allowed me to skip the prior selection from a country. I guess you remember the dimensions of Brazil. It's an enormous country, and the federal universities that are public, they have a wide gathering. A lot of people want to be there, especially because they have the university cafeteria, transportation tickets, entrance to public events like dance, theater, others that are an important part of the training. And also considering that the size of the country makes that a lot of migration happens internally. That means from one state to the other, basically we can find 2 hours 30 on a plane. What for them has an awareness and a heightened awareness of this type of benefits, the Moragia benefit, that is possible home or lodging, the food benefit, different benefits for these students to manage to complete their education. And I entered on the first chance that we had of this detail, and they had the opportunity of finishing it. So to be able to give an example to the other migrants and the other people in vulnerable situation, besides opening our path so that after finishing my degree, I can work in the French Horn, and they can expand to education, a postgraduate and doctorate education, for which we have Venezuelan teachers within the Federal University of Bahia promoting this, so that it's not only on the degree stage, but also in the postgraduate education. That is even more limiting. And I think that as part of this program, I had to find it. And actually, I was the first promotion that managed to do that. The first person that got graduated through this initiative, considering that they were able to accept my prior studies in Venezuela as a technical university student of this. The university provided to me, not only the university, but the professors as well, and the students, all of them were happy, ecstatic, for me to be there, regardless of my accent, of a different accent. I received support in Portuguese for foreigners and many other important things that took me to finish my education, and that I'm completely pleased with the Federal University of Bahia. I hope that it can be an experience that other people can feel and replicate. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosa, for recounting your story. I think I'm also hearing quite a bit of perseverance and resilience in your story. And I think that's the strong theme that's coming through in this dialogue. I'd like to now hand over to Mr. Stephen Basil Wango, who is a mechanical engineering student originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo and studying at the Durban University of Technology, an excelling scholar of the Study Trust Scholarship. Mr. Basil Wango is also the Deputy President of the International Student Organization here at UT for 2023. And he is going to tell us about his higher education journey as well. So, Stefan, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Davinia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all, wherever you may be. So my journey actually starts back in Zambia, my place of birth. I was actually born at the Mahebe settlement, which is a refugee settlement, refugee camp, as some may say. So this makes me a refugee from birth. I was actually born a refugee. This happened because my parents were actually fleeing from Congo, as Professor Alain did mention earlier on, due to wars that we experienced back at home. And on their way to fleeing, they got stuck in Zambia. And that is where I was born. We actually spent 3 years there. So they got there around 1999, and I was born 2002, which is 3 years later. And after I was born, that is when they decided to continue their migration to South Africa. Being in South Africa as a refugee from a young age was not easy. We did live in a shelter in South Africa for the first few years of my life. And every morning we would go to the beachfront and sit at the beachfront. People would come and help us, with food and clothing. And this is as much as I can remember. So I did attend primary school and high school here in South Africa, which I would say was not really an easy experience as a refugee. But then reflecting at that moment, I would say it was not an easy experience. But as a child, I did not really notice it because I did not really know that I was a refugee. In my head, I thought it was normal. I thought that is how we all are, not knowing that I was actually a refugee. This is something I only realized when I actually got to grow up and I got to know these things. So primary school and high school was a bit normal. The real challenge is when I actually needed to access higher education, being university. So I did complete my matric, but then accessing higher education is really tough because of funding. University was quite expensive. As Professor Alain did mention, we are treated as international students. So there are additional funds in which we do have to pay. These funds are funds that we do not have at all. So I was stuck at home after high school, not being able to attend university. So on my end, I was forced to try and raise these funds. So my first option was to try work. So I did take a gap year. I did not attend any school for a year, and I just worked and worked towards saving funds in order to access university. So after a year of working, I was able to raise enough funds to access university. And once I did access university, I did work and study at the same time. But then this was not easy at all. Being a student and working full-time, 10 hours a day, really took a lot out of me. So I had to find ways of actually trying to be a full-time student without having to work at all. That's when I started doing my research on ways to get funded as a refugee in South Africa. And options were very limited because in all the research I did not find anything that I could actually fund refugees in South Africa. And just when I was about to give up, I was able to find something that gave me hope. And it was mentioned earlier on, being the Daffy Scholarship, which is a German scholarship for refugees all around the world. So I did apply for that, not knowing how it may go, but I was hoping for the best. And I was fortunate enough to be shortlisted, and I did undergo interviews, and I was successful in that. And this was after trying so many things. And just when I was about to give up, that is when I did find the Daffy Scholarship, in which I am currently funded by. And this actually made things a bit, easier for me as a student, not having to actually, focus on where funds would come from, but then actually put my full mind in my studies without having to actually worry about funds. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'd like to now ask all three panelists to share, based on your experience, what initiatives do you think higher education institutions, NGOs, governments, and international organizations, what it is that they can do to promote or expand access and increase success rates for refugees and forcibly displaced people in higher education? I'm going to ask Stefan to maybe answer that question first. And
Yes. Okay, so on my end, what I would actually say is if higher education institutions could actually increase the percentage of refugees that they actually enroll every year, it would make a big difference. As Professor Alain did mention earlier on again, example for our university, out of 33,000 students, only 65 are refugees. And this is mostly due to the limits and places actually available for refugees or asylum seekers. So if they were to actually maybe increase the percentage in which they actually allow to be enrolled each year, it would make it much easier for some people to actually enroll into university and increase their chances as well. That would be from me.
Thank you, Stefan. Anoud, can I ask you to come in and perhaps tell us about, some of the initiatives that you think would contribute to access?
Sure. Actually, I agree with Stefan. Like he mentioned a similar point to the one that I have in mind. So like as previously mentioned, only 6% of refugees have access to higher education. And it is important to note here that this percentage not only represents the limited number of refugees who are able to access higher education, but also highlights the significant challenges they may face in accessing it. I would also say that, for example, to provide scholarship opportunities, local scholarship to the region that they are in. For example, I'm talking in about Jordan. I know like many women's or girls, their society or their cultures, they don't allow them to travel abroad in order to study. So why there are no many opportunities locally for them to study in Jordanian university or in any region they are in, to stay with their families. Also, other points, if you look in deep more into most of the scholarships, they do require high standard or English proficiency and a lot of other requirements. But talking about refugees, they lack the basics. So how they're gonna improve their English? They have a financial barrier. So why we don't lower the standard, or in general provide more opportunities to let them access to higher education wherever they are?
Thank you, Anoud. I think those strategies are really important, and hopefully some of our institutions, our governments, our NGOs will be able to take some of the suggestions you are making and see how we can strategically implement them. Javier, would you like to come in and tell us about some of the initiatives that you've thought of that could perhaps make the process easier?
Sí, inicialmente me siento muy
Well, to start, I feel really hyped by the story of Anoud and Stephen. Thank you so much. I feel that a migrant becomes part of the same fabric of reality of the natives of a place. So being able to improve their conditions, being able to improve the general situation of them, because we are directly or indirectly related in the territory. And if we go beyond in the world, so to me, in Brazil, it happens also. And it's a contribution, a direct economic contribution from people or company that need to pay taxes. They can directly send this money to some things, like it can be funds for higher education, to support in different ways those students. And something important too, when we are changing our country, you change a language or change our manners, and we're in a vulnerable situation in the street looking for a job or trying to make ends meet or doing our lives, it's very important to receive information. And also the social part that helps for you, that you can study at any age, any career that you would like to have, something that you like, that you can work and you can make ends meet from that. So it's important for me, the support and the help. The people that have that information can promote it and can make it reach the people that are refugees, that are vulnerable, that usually they are isolated and they usually don't understand how the process works. So we have these two options. So we have the people that require revenues, that the state is forcing them to pay taxes, can have a direct way to help either people or projects, so that people with less economic resources can access education directly. The people feel that they know where these resources are going to, and this can help a lot. And the information, especially on the alternatives, on the aids, on the psychological aids, any type of aids that can be expanded massively before people that not necessarily have the same ease of access to the modern information.
Thank you very much, Javier. I think what you're raising is really important, in that, you know, some of the challenges that you experience are exacerbated by the lack of access to information, and information on what support there is. So I think, you know, this is a small change that could enhance the access for refugees, asylum seekers, and forcibly displaced people, if the information is cascaded down and promoted. You know, there may be some assistance there. So thank you to Anud, to Javier, and to Stefan for sharing their journeys. We have a Q&A session also, and the first question that we have in the chat is, what is your biggest personal challenge when entering higher education? So what was your biggest personal challenge when entering your higher education journey? I'd like to ask the audience to please post some more questions in the chat if you have any. And I'm going to ask Javier to perhaps tell us about his personal challenge first, since we have him on the screen, and then we'll move on to the other two.
Bueno.
Well, I think that one of my personal challenges was how to keep myself in economic terms, how to keep a safe haven, a safe roof, knowing that economically speaking, there were not many opportunities for musicians, formal opportunities for musicians in the region. And maybe I would have to move outside from my profession, and I knew that there were some partners that took advantage of this opportunity and had difficult jobs. They were living farther away, that the university cafeteria allowed for less than $1 to have lunch and supper. This was something that encouraging to move forward. This was important because I felt that I was being benefited by this. And I felt that I needed to put a part to chip in to work on this, on what the university meant for me, because the university also allowed me to be part of something, considering that I didn't have something in terms of employment or even in terms of visa. It was being an important part of my of being in the city to learn. From the World University. I learned at that time, in those 4 years, that the World University is talking about a universe of possibilities that within the music career I had, from knowing people from audiovisual, people that were doing some postgraduate studies, people that were doing political sciences, management, even dance, theater, and other careers that were calling my attention, that nurtured me as a person, and that allowed me to be a better example for the world. Because if we want to improve, we have to start with ourselves. And in a vulnerable situation, it's easy to take a bad path or to surrender, or in some way to be part of the problem and not the solution. So this was a challenge for me. And giving an example, because if I, being the first promotion, I managed to have the results in a good way, and I'm a good example for the others, this is going to give good air to the university to continue with the initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. Perhaps I can ask Stefan to talk about, one or two of his personal challenges in accessing the university.
Oh yes. So my personal challenges in accessing university. When it comes to accessing, I would not really say I did face my challenges. I did face challenges, but the real challenges was when I was actually in university itself. Having to actually stay in university was the biggest challenge that I did face personally, because while studying, I had to, as I did mention, for my first year work 10 hours, which is not really easy. So I would work 10 hours a day and try balance that with school. So it did take a big toll on me, because I did see my marks downgrading, and I had to try and make a way to actually perform while at school, while trying to find means to actually pay for the school in which I was in. And this is really challenging for me. And it did take a lot out of me as well. So that was the biggest challenge that I did face. And I'm really glad that I did have managed to conquer that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And quickly, if I can move on to Anud to share one of her personal challenges with us.
Sorry, I'm having an internet issues right now. Would you mind repeating your question so I hear it properly?
Sure. So the question was, what personal challenge did you experience in accessing the university system or accessing a university?
Mm-hmm. All right. So it is a good point actually also to mention is that like going to Canada, especially to McGill, which is a prestigious university, and having like a weak background about how is the educational system in general. Like I took my education in Jordanian public school, so I wasn't really like, ready to become like competitive at McGill with people from all over the world with like a strong background or educational background. So this was like one of the most challenging thing, is that I was not prepared. So yeah, like I tried so hard. My first year was like a nightmare. It was like full of challenging, but yeah, with working, and never losing hope, work hard, the one can achieve his or her goal.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Anud, to Stefan, and to Javier for sharing your journey with us and for engaging in the Q&A. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Emma Sabzalieva to do our vote of thanks. Emma?
Okay, thank you. Well, the time has really flown past today. As ever, we wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of this session. So we've heard, so much, both from this kind of multi-level perspective, but also I think more importantly from the testimony from the lived experiences of our students and recent graduates who've been so generous to share those with us today. I think perhaps as a takeaway, there are sort of three issues I think that we can all collectively work forwards on. The one, big one, of course, is funding. And how we arrange, that kind of financial supports for refugees and forcibly displaced people in higher education. Another really important strand, which I heard from everybody, was about access to information. So that could be knowing where the scholarships are, it could be knowing which universities might be able to support you, those kind of opportunities. So again, thinking collectively about how we can advocate and to improve access to information that is relevant to promote the right to higher education. And the third, just as Anud was talking about in her last point, is about then how do we support students once they're in higher education? So not, halfway through their course, but actually right before even the course starts. What are the things that people would need more support with? What are the assumptions in higher education institutions that might be taken for granted, which actually we shouldn't take for granted? And in fact, when we're supporting very different populations, we need to think more carefully about. So I would leave everybody, I think, with those three things, but bearing in mind, of course, that many other topics were discussed very much more eloquently today. So on behalf of UNESCO IESALC and our team, we'd like to thank our partners, Durban University of Technology, Kiron, and again, extending our sincere gratitude to everybody who's joined us today, to our guests, to our students and graduates who shared with us, to our interpreters, to the team behind the scenes. There's a lot of people on the back end of this webinar, not even on the webinar, and these are the people that make these kind of events possible. We'd like to thank you, for supporting refugees and forcibly displaced people, for helping and advocating in your own ways to promote the right to higher education worldwide. And just as a sign off, the recording of this webinar will be available. We invite you to keep in touch with us at the Institute, with our partners. You can follow through our social media accounts. In the recording, you'll be able to follow that from our YouTube channel on IESALC. So we look forward to seeing you at an upcoming event. We thank you again, and goodbye for today.